Tom, thank you for taking the time. I have been wanting this opportunity since I heard you speak. I want to say at least 5 years ago. So I'm super grateful for your time and all of the amazing things you're going to share. What I learned from you that day has not only changed the way I think and operate, but my being able to share your message has changed so many other people as well. So you're awesome.
Oh, thank you.
Can you share sort of your backstory because it's really intriguing that somebody like you with the accomplishments and the accolades started where you did.
Yeah, I think the thing that we were talking about is so I was born in Taiwan, but then my family immigrated to the US when I was quite young, so just around 2 years old. And I was the third kid, and my parents like were in a new country. They're working multiple jobs in order to make ends meet. They didn't totally speak the language, so they were quite busy both with the other kids and the jobs and all that sort of thing. And what it basically meant is that I'm not sure how to phrase it other than like not they didn't exactly take care of me. There was like a neighbor across the hall that they would like leave me who had some kids as well that kind of leave me there as an informal daycare during the day. And because of it, kind of nobody was actually teaching me language. So that, because I think that neighbor mostly spoke Spanish and didn't end up teaching me a bunch of Spanish. So it meant that by the time I got to first grade, I was basically, I couldn't read, write, or speak any language exactly. I could understand some words in some languages, but not that much. And actually, the reason that my name is Tom is that on the first day of school, I couldn't understand the teacher asking me the question, "What is your name?" So
Wow.
they named me in order to label the cubbyhole.
Wow.
So that was my level of language skill getting into school. But like what it meant was that for a longer period than I think most people these days have, I wasn't thinking with words primarily. I was thinking primarily with pictures and numbers because numbers made enough sense to me, and there's very few of them to learn. So compared to like words, where there's a lot more words than there are numerals, then I got the hang of numbers, but I definitely had the hang of pictures. Like I would think mostly by visualizing exactly how a thing kind of worked and like what it would look like as it was happening.
Did you find now looking back that your ability to think in an abstract way is the reason? Like, do you feel like that unfortunate set of circumstances was part of the reason that you developed in a way that was just sort of innate and natural to you, as opposed to being, sort of indoctrinated by the school system or by, parents who were indoctrinated by the school system as far as like a certain kind of learning and this is right and this is wrong and this is how it all kind of is supposed to be?
It's definitely true. Yeah, though I would actually kind of flip it around and say that I wasn't practicing abstract thinking. I was practicing incredibly concrete thinking. I think the school system teaches you all types of abstractions. Some of them are true, some of them are, true in some instances, and some of them are not that true or not often true in the real world. And we had been talking a little bit before the interview. It's like a thing that the school system teaches you over and over implicitly. This is not even kind of a lesson they're trying to teach you, is that there will be tests, and when there is a question there is one right answer.
Hmm.
And because honestly, how could you grade a test if there was like 50 right answers to every single question? So we basically teach kids over and over that like problems that come up, there probably is a way just to look up the answer and there is one right answer. And I think that's true of things that people have already done before, or just historical facts that you want to kind of look up, or kind of established scientific facts that come from a history of experimentation. Like, yeah, there are things that you can just look up and there will be one answer to. But most of the problems that we solve practically in life are ones where, yeah, there's probably 10 ways, 15 ways that would be totally good approaches to handling a thing. So, number one, not one right answer. Number two, not something that you can look up. You can't just look up like, so I've been having problems with my friend Shelly and she wants to do so and so and I'm not okay with it, blah blah blah. It's like no one like wrote that in a history book or a math book or whatever. You can't just look up the answer. So I think like we kind of teach people those sorts of assumptions, which are largely not true about the world. And we also do teach people a lot of abstractions. Like words themselves are abstractions, right? Like if you say the word apple, then it doesn't refer to any specific apple, it refers to all the apples. And because of it, like it's actually something from the AFES talk that I gave, which is like nouns actually kind of diffuse your cognition. You actually stop thinking about things and noticing them as soon as you put the noun on them. Because if I showed you an apple and your brain says, oh, that's an apple, then a lot of times your brain is already satisfied. It basically says, they showed me an apple, I saw it as an apple, the thing is an apple, we're done. What's the next subject, right?
Well, that
And
was really impactful when you were talking that day because you were talking about the difference between knowing and learning. And
yeah.
the example you gave for the crowd was exactly that. You took a fork out of your pocket and you talked about what was happening in the brain waves of everybody sitting in the audience, and you just described that beautifully. We wondered what it was, we realized what it was, and then we stopped thinking about it.
Yep, within seconds, because as soon as you recognize it as a fork, you're done. And then if you wanted to kind of, and this is actually one of the things that the education system drives into us effectively in teaching us language. And whenever we show a picture and say, what is this? And people say, it's a fork. And then you move to the next flashcard. What is this? It's a beach ball. But like what we're missing here is the mind has a lot more potential. And
Mm.
whenever we have like these quick kind of short circuits and we identify something as the noun and we stop thinking, then we stop noticing. So in the talk, I kind of, start inquiring about the fork. And the magic question is, you know, whatever you think a thing is, you can then ask the follow-up question, which is, but how is it nuanced? So with the fork, you could say, well, hey, this is a fork. Sure. Everybody in the audience like looks at it and they nod and they say, yeah, it's a fork. But then if you ask, well, how is it nuanced? Then you might, notice, well, it's made of stainless steel. And then you say, well, how is that nuanced? Well, steel is something that we actually developed, in working with iron and figuring out how to strengthen it. And, well, how is that nuanced? Well, iron is something that is there's a lot of it in, on Earth and in the Earth's crust, but universally, it is actually a relatively rare element, and it's something that can only be produced by supermassive stars and by supernova. And like very quickly, like something that starts as a very innocent question, a very simple question around, here's a fork, but how is it nuanced? If you keep on asking that question, how is it nuanced, you will eventually like reach a connection point with how the entire universe formed, as well as the history of culture that led to the invention and widespread use of the fork and a million other things, which basically is just to say that all of that was in the fork in the first place, but there was kind of two relationships that we could have to it cognitively. One was a knowing orientation where you kind of show it and you say, oh yeah, it's a fork. I know it's a fork, right? What else is there to say? And then the other is a learning orientation where through a series of, layered questions where you just continue to ask, okay, but how is that nuanced? Whatever answer that you get, you say, well, how's that nuanced? And that's definitely true for nouns like a fork, but it's also true for anything else that we're mentally stuck on. So you might be mentally stuck in a situation where you say, oh, I don't like this coworker and they're blah, right? And as soon as you say they are blah, it's almost like saying this is a fork. You've
Mm.
basically arrived at like a static relationship to it where your cognition shuts down. You say, well, I can't work with that coworker, they're a blah, or I can't, where they did this. And like if there's a type of like, you know, permanence in your mind to it because of the relationship that you've taken to the statement. But even in that kind of tough workplace situation, And if you ask somebody about that, they'll be like, oh no, but it's true. There was a time when they did this, and there's a time when they did that, and da da da. And it's like, okay, okay. But if you ask a different question where you said, okay, well, you believe that's true, but how is it nuanced? And then they might get into something that's actually starts to be a little bit more interesting, because it's like, well, actually everything was good between us until a year ago when so and so happened. And you say, okay, well, how's that nuance? And it's like, well, I guess I got really upset because I felt like I had really told them that this was the case, and they completely ignored me. But I guess I don't really know exactly why they ignored me. And then you say, well, how is that nuanced? And it's like, well, I guess I could actually ask them, yeah, you know, whether what they were intending to do when that happened. And all of a sudden things will start to loosen up a little bit. Like space starts to open up where learning can come back in, as opposed to, well, here's why I don't like that coworker, or this is a fork. So in the talk, I kind of explained that knowing and learning are two states of mind that you can be in, and that they are verbs. And typically, um, when you are trying to do two verbs at once, you can't do it well, right? If somebody says, "Well, I want you to juggle and ride a bicycle at the same time," it's pretty hard. And honestly, any two verbs, it's like, "I want you to check your email and take care of the kids at the same time." Well, that's actually going to be pretty hard. Like, there's going to be a bunch of things whenever you try to jam two verbs together and do them both simultaneously. It tends to be pretty hard. But in the brain system, knowing and learning are even more antithetical than that, in that one of the modes actually keeps the other mode from even being possible, from the brain biochemistry perspective. Because the way that we go and form memories is we're having we're having an experience, and the experience inside of the brain is a somatosensory experience, where basically we have all our sense impressions, all of our physicality, all of our mental processes, all these things will be kind of going on. And when something notable happens, then basically some chemistry comes from the hippocampus, which freezes the somatosensory trace as a memory that we can then go back and reference in the future. Now, when you're in a state of learning, you're basically experiencing all that somatosensory input, and the hippocampus and the system in your brain that helps to determine what is notable and what is meaningful are basically creating these little memory moments, which are then allowing you to move things into short-term memory, some of which will be promoted to long-term memory. And in that process, one is experiencing and learning. But when we move into a state of knowing, then actually that process effectively shuts down. And what we are doing is we are referencing a historical somatosensory trace, a historical memory trace, and relaying it. And typically the hippocampus is not releasing a bunch of chemistry to form new memories as you are sharing old memories, because it would make a muck of everything, right? Like it would overwrite a bunch of your old memories. And there's a tiny extent to which that happens, but pretty slowly and not that much. I mean, you can shift the memory if you keep on retelling it over and over in a different way than how you experienced it, which is why, sometimes like people are like questioned, like prisoners are questioned and like forced to eventually admit crimes because they've just been told over and over. It's like, no, you did it this way, blah, blah, blah. But outside of that very kind of extreme case, or people kind of like in a state of denial or in a state of like reframing, where you're trying to really actively shift a historical memory, like that is not how the brain typically works. The brain typically works by, when you get into knowing and like sharing a historical memory mode, then it shuts down the learning mode, right? It doesn't want you to overwrite the traces that you had stored in memory in the past.
Total,
So
totally
yeah.
makes sense, and really valuable too. And when you look back through your history of things that you've invented or new ideas you've had, your relationship to possibility is not just inspiring, but also informative about a better way for all of us to think about some of the things you were talking about, the noticing. And oftentimes I'll talk about the reticular activating system in your brain, whereby,
Oh yeah.
like I needed a new vehicle and I thought, well, it'd be nice to have a convertible, but I'm small, so I also wanted a truck. And then I'm like, well, maybe I should get a Jeep. And then that week, that's all I was seeing everywhere is Jeep after Jeep after Jeep. And it's interesting how many pieces of, like, billions and billions of pieces of data that your brain is not noticing. So for you, like, you have your track record is shockingly stellar. Would you have any advice for people in terms of your relationship, or our relationship, to possibility and being able to even imagine the unseen, so that you can take something that has never previously existed and say, well, it hasn't existed yet?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these things are intertwined in that part of the reason that people don't invent things and create new things is they very quickly come to judgment on what things are, and then their cognition shuts down. Because if I basically said, if I, um, put a pencil in front of you and said, what is that? And you said, well, that's a pencil, then not a lot of creativity is going to come from that, right? You basically say, well, that's a pencil. Maybe you pick it up, look at it a little bit, and put it right back down. But if you kind of apply some of the things that we've talked about already and you start to ask, well, how is it nuanced? Well, number one, you're going to see a lot more about what a pencil is. And then if you start asking some generative questions, so the how is it nuanced is kind of a digging in, exploring, noticing at greater depth type question and cognition pattern. But like, let's say you've done that and you have a bunch of working material because you see so much about a pencil, then you can kind of move your mind into a little bit more of a generative imaginative mode, where you kind of ask yourself, well, given that a pencil is made out of wood, what are like five things that I might be able to use that for? And if you wanted to go add some more creativity, then yeah, a lot of times creativity is spurred by constraints. So if you asked yourself, it's made out of wood, what are five interesting things I could do with it, in the next 15 minutes? And 15 minutes creates a time constraint and all that sort of thing. But you will find, a pencil that just would have sat on a table that a person would have walked by every single day of their life and done nothing interesting with, suddenly becomes insanely interesting in 15 minutes. And they've made something interesting out of it in 15 minutes, which basically kind of, and I teach this thing called rapid prototyping. I'm using a little bit of a trivial example here, but like, I basically teach people to make substantial progress on their problems in kind of a 15 to 30-minute time period, really just by moving their mind into these alternative states of cognition where the possibility was always sitting there. Like, the pencil was on your desk for a long time. And this is why we get like really amazed whenever we see an artist that is like use some real basic thing, like, oh, they made this out of bottle caps. Holy crap. Oh, they made this out of, whatever, like pencil shavings, or like thrown out office paper or whatever. That's amazing, right? Because the potential was always there in those things. We just like walked past it in the office recycling bin, and we walked past it in all these settings, and that person basically just applied slightly different cognition for a day, a week, a month, like however long it took to make the piece, and just made apparent the potential that was always there in the first place.
Mm.
So I would kind of break it down to a couple steps. Like, one is anything that you want to shake up, then there's kind of a get unstuck step. And that one is like a 1 minute exercise that I do with people, where I basically have them right at the top of a page, like something that they're really stuck on, right? It's like, oh, whatever, the coworker that you don't like, some tough situation at home, some problem that you've been working on for a project and you're just stuck on it. And you write that as at the top of the page. And then I give folks like 1 minute to go write, 3 to 5 things that they know for sure about that situation. And typically they'll be like, oh, they will actually write a bunch of things that are pertinent to why they're stuck. Or they'll be like,
Mm.
oh, well, I know that this coworker would never agree on so and so, so that's why we can't, move forward. Oh, number two, like their department has this kind of priority, and like, we'll never be important to them. Number three, and they'll kind of like write out a couple things within a minute or so. And then the conclusion of the exercise is really, I ask them to circle any one of them. And sometimes in order to make it simple, I'll just like circle number two, circle number three, like whatever, because honestly, it doesn't even matter which one they circle. And then I tell them, okay, now you have exactly 1 minute to go and look at the thing that you circled and ask yourself the question, okay, this is a thing I know for sure, but what is there still to learn about it? And just like forcing yourself into that question for 1 minute completely unsticks people, where
Hmm.
they're like, oh yeah, I guess I was saying that I know that this coworker would never do so and so, but a thing that I still might learn about it is, well, why are they like that? Or why is that so important to them? Or, how did it come to be that like we're in this spot right now? Or, are there some other things that I don't understand about their project that's making them act this way? Right. And all of a sudden, the thing where that started as like dissatisfaction and dislike, maybe all the way up through hatred, becomes a thing where it's like, I actually probably still could learn some stuff about this. And the stuckness, starts to dissolve. Now, that's basically moving out of a type of default cognition, which, has us be intrinsically uncreative. Now, once you get into that, then you can start doing some of the other steps that I talked about, which is like the deep noticing and then the generative aspects of cognition. And I'm talking about all these things in like more formal ways because I think a lot of your audience is going to be adults, and that's like the language that they need to hear to go get it. But we've been chatting briefly before the call about I believe that this like these types of cognitions are actually the way that we primarily learned between the ages of 0 and 5, right? Like we didn't have a lot of knowing to apply in the first place. There wasn't a lot of
Mhm.
frameworks, like a 3-year-old doesn't come by and say like, well, I reject that because it's outside of this conceptual framework. They're like,
Right.
how does this work? Right? Or it's like, what happens if I open that? And it's actually, that is a extremely, extremely useful, collection of cognitive abilities. And I think we marvel at it from a distance because we say like, oh yeah, this kid was born in Switzerland and by the age of 5 they spoke 5 languages. And you're like, oh damn, how did they learn all that? And it's like, well, it wasn't by sitting down and like talking about like verb conjugations and how gerunds are used or whatever. They didn't do it through a series of abstract concepts. They did it through a noticing, experiencing, trial, experimentation, like a set of cognitive skills that we're all intrinsically born with and primarily use in order to learn very quickly for the first 5 years. And then, we get into school, and sometimes that shifts the course of that, and sometimes it shifts the course of that very substantially. And sometimes it shifts the course of it so much that we get so allied with the abstract concepts and the ideologies that we stop noticing what the actual world is like.
Hmm. That's super powerful. So, do you think there is an element? Well, two questions actually. So, you were talking about the example of the coworker, and I've personally experienced this where I had maybe a situation where I was not feeling so great about somebody, um, and then maybe had the chance to speak with them. And there is an accounting for emotion in there as well. Do you think that is a factor when it comes to how you feel about something and then what you think about them subsequently?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the topic of emotion relative to cognition is also a very wide and varied topic. There's a lot to it. The main stuff I would pay attention to is stuckness, because basically stuckness is typically not a if you are stuck, or your perception of something has stuck for a long time, then it's probably not a correct perception because everything in the universe is in some process of change. And sometimes it's a fast process of change, sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's, punctuated and, going fast, then going slow, then going fast, then going slow. But to the extent that you're mentally stuck on anything, it typically means that you have stopped noticing. So
Mm.
that is definitely, and this goes with emotion as well, where it's like, I'm still mad at this person from 20 years ago. And it's like,
Yeah.
I think things have changed a little bit. I mean, you still may not like them, but like just all the charge around it, it doesn't need to be stuck. I mean, if you feel like it's serving you in some way, then great. But I tend to find that people end up holding on to it longer, and it hurts them. I very rarely see people that drop emotion too quickly and it hurts them. um Now that said, that's possible too, it's just much more rare.
Mm. Do you think that the connection with and understanding in relation to possibility affects somebody's ability to solve a problem that maybe was previously unsolvable? And the example I'm thinking about is, I think it was in the 1930s, a guy named George Denzig was going to UC Berkeley, and he was in this high level math class, and the teacher put a couple problems on the board, but he came in super late to the class, and the teacher said, which he didn't hear, the first problem is your homework, and then the second problem is, if you just want to have some, like, a brain workout, it's a math problem that has literally never been solved before. But George didn't hear that, so he went home and he started on his homework. He did the first problem, no issues. The second one was a bit of a monster, so it took him a
Mhm.
really long time, but finally figured it out. And then he submitted it, and then gets a call from the professors and just saying, you just solved an previously unsolvable math problem. And for him, he didn't hear the statement before, which was that it wasn't possible, so he didn't approach it in that way. For those of us who are, you know, perhaps looking to do something that we've never done before that is outside of our realm, do you have any thoughts or advice on a way for us to initiate that process of believing in something that hasn't formally existed?
Yeah, I think actually even in the question, there's a lot of interesting texture to it because you, if you think about the way that a kid learns, there isn't actually a lot of justification that's required before they try something new. It's like, well, how come noodles can't be in my hat? And it's like, well, I mean, they don't sit there like pondering, like, oh, that might just be irrational. Like, what will people think of me if there's like a noodle on my hat? No, I won't go in that direction. Maybe I'll like evaluate more opportunities. Kids don't think like that. They're just like, oh, that's the thing I could try, so let me try it. And
Mm.
like first, I would go and submit that that remains true all throughout your life, whether you end up believing it to be true or not. I think there is a bunch of it as well where, from the status perspective and from like the like reputation and image perspective or whatever, it's like, well, I wouldn't want to be seen like doing something that I'm bad at or whatever. And it's like, well, I don't know. I think that entire thought process is already a pretty dangerous thought process, which is anybody learning anything is going to be bad at it for a while. I mean, is not going to be as skilled at it as people that have been doing it for a while. But everybody who's skilled at anything, like went through a period where they weren't particularly skilled at it. So how is that special? Like, how is that a problem? I think like we take something which is just going to be a natural fact of the learning process, and then we heighten it into some kind of problem. Or it's like, or people do things where it's like, well, why would I start on that now? I'm too old. I'll never get good enough. Or da-da. It's like, and I think it's because like we have such a culture where, you know, you're a winner, or like second place is like first loser kind of sensibility.
Mm-hmm.
And in truth, it's like most of the stuff that's worth doing doesn't have an absolute winner, right? Like who is the best musician in all of history? I don't know. There's lots of styles of music, and honestly, there's like thousands of geniuses at least, and
Totally.
right. So it's like most things are more like that. And given that, it's like, well, what would it even mean to be ranking myself against everybody else all the time? Like, wouldn't it actually be okay that like so and so is like a genius at jazz and this other person is a genius at Zydeco and some other person is like a genius at, punk rock? That's actually fine, right? So like when you get started in a thing, then you should understand that not being that skilled at it is very normal and honestly the only way before you eventually become moderately skilled and very skilled at a thing. There is no absolute ranking that you need to go charge yourself against because a lot of times people won't start because it's like, well, since I'm not going to be one of the best or since I'm not going
Exactly.
to be great at this. And it's like, well, what if you were the greatest punk rocker? Like that would still affect a lot of people, even if a person that was deeply musically trained will be like, well, if you go and analyze, the score of their songs, it's honestly incredibly simple. It's like just a couple power chords, same three chords in this song, same five chords in that song, hardly anything to note from the music theory perspective. But sorry, that person's still doing genius work. And
Hmm.
I think like we get like real heavy on the self-critique and criticism and all these like abstract comparison points, and we miss that there is just direct embodied joy in playing music, even if no one would point to you as the best in the world or even one of 1,000 geniuses or whatever. It's like, hey, I love punk rock, I play punk rock, it's amazing, right? Or there's joy in dancing, or there's joy in drawing, or there's joy in learning a technical skill, even if you end up not being a person who's a professional mechanical engineer or whatever, there's joy in it. And I think it's like if we were to just get excited about like how joyful it is to learn and go from have no experience and no ability in a thing to have a little experience and a little ability in a thing, if like we because that's also the joy that kids experience too, right?
The
they
process.
yeah, they do the tiniest thing, they dance a little bit and they're joyful about it, and then the parents are joyful about it, and that creates a whole kind of learning environment
Mm.
versus if they took their first couple steps and it's like, you're not really the best and you're probably never going to be the best, and it's is it even really worth your time to like move around like that? Maybe you should stop. And those are the thoughts that we have in our own heads. I'm not even saying that, but if you heard a parent say that, you'd be like, oh well, that kid's never going to dance.
Exactly. I so appreciate you sitting down and spending the time with us. Your background is so diverse and so incredible. Last question. If, with all of the amazing things that you've done, if you were to only be able to leave behind one message or one legacy, what would that be for you?
Hmm. My name in Chinese means, my first name means good education, and my last name means to remember or commemorate. But yeah, in those languages, you typically, say the last name first. So like my whole name read together, not Tom, which I got arbitrarily on the first day of school, but like my name in Chinese basically read directly across basically means to remember or commemorate like a great education, and in a
Hmm.
way that is kind of what I'm trying to do in my work, which is really dig into what types of cognition serve us and really work and allow us to continue to learn and create a great education for ourselves, and not in the, oh, I went to Harvard and got a 4.0 kind of thing,
Right.
but in the kind of sensibility of the ways of thinking that help us to invent, that help us to create, that help us to learn about how to be in the world. um, and I think that any of the lessons that I have on that front would be great to pass along. I think all of them have got enough depth to them that if you only had one, it would already do something.
Hmm. Amazing. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. This has been an absolute honor.
Oh, thanks.